In 1946, director Frank Capra and star Jimmy Stewart gave the world a true masterpiece that has charmed generations of moviegoers.
In 2020, we try a whiskey that is sure to warm the cockles.
The film is It's a Wonderful Life.
The whiskey is a Midwinter Night's Dram.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at the 1946 Christmas masterpiece, It's a Wonderful Life.
Mary, I know what I'm going to do tomorrow and the next day and next year and a year after that. I'm shaking the dust of this crummy little town off my feet and I'm going to see the world. Italy, Greece, the Parthenon, the Colosseum. Then I'm coming back here and go to college and see what they know. And then I'm going to build things. I'm going to build airfields. I'm going to build skyscrapers 100 stories high. I'm going to build bridges a mile long. Well, you going to throw a rock? Hey, that's pretty good. What'd you wish, Mary?
Brad, you know, I've been thinking about what to put in this Christmastime slot for this year. It's the 30th anniversary this year of the movie Home Alone, another Christmas classic. We could have gone a number of directions, Miracle on 34th Street, Christmas Vacation, Elf. But, you know, who knows how long we're going to do this podcast? Hopefully into our, mid to late 80s. But just in case we didn't get around to talking about it, I wanted to make sure that we put a movie on this list that is hands down, in my opinion, the greatest Christmas movie ever made, and that's It's a Wonderful Life.
I just had an image of us in our 80s at the nursing home together, like going up to these random, 26-year-old, interns and being like, have you listened to my podcast?
They just have like a fake microphone set up in front of us that we talk into all day. They're like, just don't tell them. They're not hurting anybody. Let them be.
Ryan sets up the blog for Creed.
For Creed?
On The Office.
Exactly.
Oh, man, Bob. I'm so excited to talk about It's a Wonderful Life. Bob, I'm actually going to do something that has never once before been done in the history of the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Are you ready?
I think I know what you're going to do, and I was thinking about doing the same thing. Go for it.
This movie is a 10 out of 10.
A 10 out of 10. Yeah, absolutely.
It is, beyond being the hands-down greatest Christmas movie, just the best of all time, I would put it up there as one of the greatest films of all time, period.
It's certainly one of my favorite films of all time, and that makes it in a lot of ways even harder to look at objectively, to critique, because there are very few movies on this planet, Brad, that have as much of my heart as this movie does. I think, we did Coco a few weeks ago. That one is kind of rapidly rising for me, but It's a Wonderful Life is one of those movies that just, it evokes such a deep, visceral reaction from me that, when I hear when someone tells me that, they don't like It's a Wonderful Life as much as A Christmas Story, I'm like, I will fight you. I will physically harm you for saying that. There's just something in me.
I love Cleveland to death, but A Christmas Story can go kick rocks compared to It's a Wonderful Life.
We should clarify, A Christmas Story is set in Cleveland and used Cleveland as its location for most of the shooting. So it's like a big deal around where we grew up. But you're right, Brad. It can go, I don't know, jump off a bridge like George Bailey was supposed to.
That's right. Right off the I-480 bridge.
All right, Brad. So let's get into talking about the movie. We've both already given it a 10 out of 10, and I'm glad we did because I want to play devil's advocate with this movie a little bit, knowing that we both love it. Now that I'm going to give it a 10 out of 10, because this time through, I definitely had some questions about the way the movie is set up. I'm really looking forward to getting into that with you. For those who have not seen this movie, and again, Brad, it's, almost 75 years old now. I know there's a whole younger generation of people that did not come up on this movie. It has been replaced with movies like Christmas Vacation, Elf, A Christmas Story. And so less and less frequently do I see people our age who are even really familiar with this movie. So it might be really important for us to do Brad Explains on this film today. And Brad, we don't really need to get into like a super long, detailed explanation of the movie, but like just generally so people can follow along with us, can you break down the plot of It's a Wonderful Life?
Yeah, I do have a question for you first, though, Bob. For how much I love this movie, I never knew that there was a color version of it. Have you ever watched this in color, or are you a purist?
Yeah, so this is a thing that happened in the late 80s, early 90s, when Ted Turner started buying the rights to all these classic movies, and Turner Classic Movies became a thing. He was really obsessed with the idea of digitally colorizing old movies. He thought that it was like a really cool kind of passion project, that he could put his stamp on these films by colorizing them, maybe introduce them to a new audience. It became very controversial because legions of filmmakers were like, you can't do that to someone. If they wanted this movie to be in color, it would have been in color. It's in black and white. Leave it alone, Ted Turner.
I think that reminds me of one of my favorite Calvin and Hobbes comic strips, when Calvin asks his dad, why are old movies and pictures in black and white? And he goes, because the entire world was in black and white back then, son. We didn't really get color until about 1939, 1940.
But with movies like It's a Wonderful Life, and, we don't have to get into a ton of the backstory on this, but basically what happened with this movie is the copyright lapsed and this movie became public domain. And it was a movie that when it came out, not a lot of people liked, not a lot of people saw. It was a huge box office flop. But because it became public access, they could show it on TV for next to nothing. And so it became such a fixture on TV around the holidays that people just got used to seeing it. And it slowly started to gain this reputation as a movie that people would have on in their homes around Christmas time, and became a classic by rising up through like the public access TV show channels. But because of that, the copyright, no one was really holding the copyright for a long time. And so Ted Turner could do whatever the hell he wanted with this movie. And so we have a colorized version of It's a Wonderful Life. You can find it even now. They've completely restored it, just like they've restored the black and white version. So on the Blu-ray that I have, they offer a color version. I've never really gotten around to watching it, Brad. I just there's something about colorized black and white. If you've ever seen like a little clip on YouTube where they've done that, the colors never look natural. They never look quite right. And so I've never sat down and spent 2 hours watching the color version of this. Did you watch color?
No, I just saw, when I looked on Amazon Prime to watch this, it had It's a Wonderful Life, and then it had It's a Wonderful Life, parentheses, color edition. And I was like, what? This is a travesty. But regardless of how you watch the movie, the story is the same. And the story goes a little something like this. There's this amazing man named George Bailey who is selfless and caring and a little bit angry a lot of times in his life. And he lives a really great life in this small town called Bedford Falls. He marries a girl from his high school, and he runs this old bank building and loan that helps people build houses. And he stands up to this old man Potter, who is a rich old miser. Honestly, Bob, he's kind of like Ebenezer Scrooge on crack, like as far as evilness goes. But so he fights off Potter, who, is trying to buy up everything in town and run the town how he wants to. And near the end of the film, his Uncle Billy loses $8,000, which is a literal metric you-know-what of money. Like, just a massive amount of money back when it happens. And so he loses this $8,000 at the end of the year on Christmas Eve, and the bank examiner is there, and they find out, and basically either Jimmy Stewart or his Uncle Billy is going to go to jail over this. And, Jimmy Stewart, his character's name is George Bailey. George is considering killing himself because he has a life insurance policy that will basically be worth more than what he is worth alive. And so an angel is sent down from heaven named Clarence Oddbody, angel second class, and he is sent to help George recognize the value of his life. And he does this by helping George look at the world, what Bedford Falls would look like if he had never been born. And it is a harrowing experience that really haunts George and terrifies him. And he finally comes to his knees and he asks the Lord, just please give me back my old life. I just want to see my wife and kids and the town the way it used to be. and he returns to his home, and lo and behold, all of the hundreds of people that he has helped out and sacrificed for over the years come to his home and give them money of their free will to care for, to meet this $8,000 deficit so that he won't go to jail. And we learn the important life lesson that no man is a failure who has friends. And Bob, I just sob at the end of this movie every time I watch it.
Brad, I'm going to be honest with you. There are some movies that, you know that I am a crier at movies. We have established this on the podcast before. There are some movies,
crybaby.
There are some movies that I have to like stifle my sobs because they can get so dramatic. If Coco is one of them, and then this would be one of the others. And it's the last, I'd say 5 full minutes of the movie, from the time that his wife Mary comes home. George has this experience with the angel Clarence where he's shown what his life would be like if he had never been born. And when he comes out of it and he runs back to his home and his wife comes in and says, like, it's a miracle. You're going to see they're coming now. Like, from the time she comes in and says that all the way through to the end credits, where these people that we've seen through this very slow, methodical kind of build of George Bailey's life coming back into his life to finally pay back in some way what he has invested into them with his life. I cry so hard at this movie, Brad.
Dude, like a baby. Like every single time I hit the end of this film and they start singing Auld Lang Syne, and I just lose it. Like, first off, if we wanted to talk about Auld Lang Syne in movies, this is the top moment, hands down.
Also, can we just say, Auld Lang Syne, incredibly underrated song. It should be more prominent in our lives than it is. It is just a beautiful, haunting, kind of melancholy, but still sentimental. It's the kind of song that's designed to make you weep.
Yeah, and the stupid New Year's broadcast always jumps into New York, when
they don't even finish
when it's getting
the whole
good.
Thing. Yes.
Yeah, and it drives me nuts. So New York, once again, you can go suck it. But in the end, It's a Wonderful Life is spectacular. And Bob, I really want to get into this film.
Yeah, Brad. So let me segue us like this, talking about the end of the movie where we both cry like small children. There's also a scene at the very beginning of the movie that really gets me every time I watch it. And I think it's a good segue into talking about the way the movie is structured. So the very first thing we see in this movie is this weird trip through the cosmos where we're like flying past planets as people's prayers for George Bailey are floating up to heaven. And, George is despondent and suicidal, and they're praying for him that he'll be okay. And we get to like this Andromeda galaxy, like there's stars in the heavens that are talking to each other. And you understand that they're actually representations of angels in heaven, and that they're going to send this guardian angel down to Earth to protect George Bailey. And then the way that they introduce us to his life is by basically the conduit for the audience is this angel Clarence, who's still trying to earn his wings. And they say, all right, sit down. We're going to show you like the highlight reel of his life. And it plays through basically like that, like a highlight reel from his life, starting from when he was a really small boy, leading up to tonight when he's about to commit suicide. And Brad, like, I'm kind of wondering, first of all, how do you feel about the bracketing of this movie? Because it really is just the beginning of the film that has these sort of like angelic supernatural elements, and then the last, half hour. And that middle hour and 40 minutes, you really don't get much mention or many reminders that that's what's actually happening. And I'm wondering, for you and I, we're both people of faith. Like, we believe in God. Obviously, I don't think that it's an accurate portrayal of what heaven is like or angels or any of that. But I think for some people who may be on the opposite end of that spectrum from us, people who are agnostic or atheist, I'm wondering how that whole framing device really works for them. And if the sort of supernatural, angelic stuff takes away from the rest of the story. Or is it essential?
I think that if you allow it to take away from the story, I feel like you're missing out on what the story is really about. Because the story isn't about angels or like the movie is about redemption, but it's not about redemption in like a religious sense. You know what I mean? Like the story is about the redemption of a man who thinks that there is nothing left to live for, and he comes to recognize, it's cheesy, but the line in the book that Clarence writes is true. No man who has friends is alone. And that is the essence of this movie, is George feels utterly alone in Bedford Falls. He feels like he's the only one who wants to get out but can't. Like his friends are either people who want to stay in Bedford Falls and don't want to leave, or people who want to leave Bedford Falls and get to leave. He's like the only one stuck in this purgatory of always trying to prove himself so that he can leave, and he never gets to. And so this movie is entirely about a man alone with himself. Even his wife is somebody who wants to be in Bedford Falls and doesn't want to leave. And so I think if you get frustrated by the framing device of, a Christian worldview, I do think you're just kind of missing out on something. I can understand why it might turn some people off, but I think you're really missing out on something if you allow it to.
I definitely have more to say on this, but I think this is better like second half of the podcast material. So I wanted to get back to what I was saying earlier, which is there's a scene right at the beginning that always gets me, and it's when we see George Bailey as a kid, and it's really the first or second time that he has a huge impact on someone's life that'll pay off at the end of the movie, but you don't know it in the moment. First, he saves his brother from drowning on a sheet of ice, but then he goes to work at the pharmacy that he works at. And the old man who is the pharmacist there, played phenomenally by H.B. Warner, has just found out that his son has died, and he is, drinking and drunk at work, and he is making capsules for George to deliver to some lady's house. And it turns out that he's using poison in the capsules. And George eventually gets him to understand that he has poisoned these capsules and that he can't deliver them because he's going to hurt somebody. And the old man, after slapping George around in this drunken rage, like just crumples. And the little boy actor, I think, is fantastic playing George, because the way he cries and the way they embrace each other, and George just says, like, I promise I'll never tell a soul. Like, I don't know what it is about that scene, man, but it has me crying 5 minutes into the movie every single time I see it.
We've talked a lot about in our church about like the fruits of the spirit, and it's like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, all this stuff. We never understand what goodness is all the time, but I feel like it's one of those things you know it when you see it. And that scene is illustrating goodness. Like at its core, I feel like George Bailey is just good in that moment. Like the fact that he's willing to second guess what, this druggist gave him, the fact that he reads the note and he doesn't like just go up straight up and be like, hey, like your son died. What happened there? But like he's gentle with Gower about it. Just everything about that scene is spectacular. And Bob, you're right. There's like 2 moments I cry in this movie. It's the end of the movie for like the last, like you said, about 5 minutes or so. And it's when he saves Mr. Gowers.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but I tear up at that scene every single time.
Well, and then we get walked through George's life. He grows up, he's about to go off to college, and what happens is that his dad dies, and the board basically votes that the only way they'll keep the building and loan open is if George hangs around to run it. George is very afraid that this old man, Potter, who owns half the town and is always conniving, is going to basically take over the building and loan or shut it down so he has no competition and keep the citizens of Bedford Falls living in slums. And so he sacrifices going away to college to stay behind. 4 years later, he's supposed to go to college, and then his brother Harry gets married and gets a fantastic job elsewhere in the state, and so he can't take it over. George has to stay longer. George ends up getting married to a girl that has been the love of his life, or has loved him her whole life, named Mary, played by Donna Reed. And Brad, I mean, I know we're going out of sequence here. Just, I'm trying to go through the plot of the movie, but I have to stop here and say, how fantastic is Donna Reed in this movie?
It's beyond belief, dude. She is, like, I don't know if there's a more perfect casting than Donna Reed as Mary in this movie.
Well, and by all accounts, she was like a goody two-shoes in real life. Like, not, in a way that people hated her or anything, but she was just a very earnest, didn't get into trouble, wasn't doing illicit drugs, things like that kind of person. And I think that kind of wholesomeness really comes through in this role. And in a lot of ways, this role is kind of thankless because her entire job in this movie is just to prop up the character of George Bailey and remind him of what a great guy he is. And I still think that she kind of gives, what's the word? She imbues the part with so much heart. And you can see, like, in the way that she performs as a kind of facial actress, like the tics of her face and the way that she uses her eyes. And at the end of the movie, when she's in tears at these people pouring into their house, I really think that she takes a very thankless part and makes something great out of it.
Well, I think you really see it in a few specific moments. When George comes to visit her after she's graduated from college and Sam Wainwright is calling, the anger that she shows when she shatters the record that's playing one of the worst songs ever created, known as Buffalo Gals. But that anger and frustration that kind of spills out in that moment is just perfect. I also love when they're in the alternate universe where George hasn't been born, and he chases her down the street and she runs into this bar and like faints. I think it's so different than what she is the rest of the movie that it stands out for me as like a key part of her performance. But Bob, you're right. Donna Reed is just phenomenal in this movie.
If we are going to pick some nits though, Brad, I got to say, so the last, 25 minutes of this movie are basically a dream sequence. Not really, but like it's presented that way. It's an alternate reality that Clarence the Angel takes George into. And so he runs into people in the street that he knows from his real life, but because they never knew George, he sees, the effect he had by not being there. And everyone's living a very different life. And his wife, Mary, is an old maid who works at the library. And if there's something that doesn't hold up in 2020, first of all, let's just be honest. She's a very beautiful woman, incredibly intelligent. She had, Sam Wainwright supposedly wanting to get with her, even though we saw that he was with somebody else and just kind of leading her on. But you can't tell me that there was not one suitor out there for old Mary Hatch. I don't understand. Like, what? Did we have to make her an old maid? Like, it just struck me as really offensive.
Yeah, there are certain parts of this movie that I will 100% admit are just like a little bit over the top. And like sometimes it's the like tertiary characters that don't matter at all that like are just hamming it up on screen because they know it's their one line they will ever get in any movie ever. And then in other times it's just the story itself. And this is a perfect spot where you're like, really? Like, it's just not very believable that she would end up as an old maid.
Right. But Brad, before we go to our break, we do have some kind of technical things to talk about. I think we should talk about Jimmy Stewart's performance in this movie, and then maybe a couple secondary characters like Thomas Mitchell as Uncle Billy or Lionel Barrymore as Mr. Potter. So let's just start with the big one here, Brad. What do you think of Jimmy Stewart in this movie?
Bob, I think every time I watch this movie, I just get more and more impressed by Jimmy Stewart. Like, he plays this tortured man who has so many grandiose desires and dreams, and not only desires and dreams, but talents to, like, accompany those. Like, the dude is incredibly smart. He's charismatic. Like, he's got the brains and the ability to make something of himself in the world, to blow Sam Wainwright out of the water. And yet, because of how good he is, how willing he is to sacrifice of himself for others, he is this tragic, almost like Shakespearean hero where he's continually sacrificing of himself. And if this was a Shakespearean novel, then he would, probably have committed suicide at the end and that would have been it. However, we had Frank Capra at the helm, and you get this beautiful story of redemption that really turns his character around. Like, I think that if you don't have the ending sequence where he's kissing the knob on his banister and putting it back on, and he's hugging his wife and kids, and if you don't have all of that, then it makes all of the anger, all of the despair that he shows throughout the movie a little more nihilistic, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I just think that Stewart captures this tortured man perfectly.
I do think that Jimmy Stewart is kind of at his most Jimmy Stewart in this movie. Like if you've ever heard someone do an impression of James Stewart, you've got the the concept, well. But it's also him doing like the stopping and starting of his sentences and repeating and stuttering and you're gonna have a baby, like, you know what I mean, like stuff like that. He does that a ton in this movie, and yet at the same time, I think Frank Capra really gives him a lot of freedom in the performance here. There's a lot of scenes where I kind of found myself wondering, like, I wonder if Frank Capra just kind of gave them a few lines to go off of and let the cameras roll. Because it seems like some scenes go on a little long and the actors are really just kind of playing off each other. I've always wondered, like, how much of this was scripted, how much of it was just a little bit of ad lib and improv. And I think it really comes to bear fruit later in the movie when you get to that kind of fantasy dream sequence, because Capra gives Jimmy Stewart like the best, biggest close-ups that he ever had in his whole life, in his whole career. When he runs away from his mother's house, finding out that it was a boarding house, and he like comes right into frame, and it's this like shocked, terrified, horrific looking close-up. Jimmy Stewart is able to like command a shot on his face that's that close and really sell you on it without it seeming over the top, without it seeming cheesy. I really do think this is a tour de force performance.
Yeah, I mean, having seen Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Rear Window and some of his other movies, I think Jimmy Stewart might be the greatest movie star of all time. Like,
it's got to be hard to top him. I mean,
like,
honestly.
He has so many just spectacular performances, but this one, I think on a nostalgic level and just on a technical level, it might be my favorite of his performances. Because he is so nuanced in his ability to be caring and loving and self-sacrificial, but also angry and frustrated and self-doubting, that you really get this inner conflict that is laid bare on his face, the way he carries his body, his shoulders, the tone of his voice. I just am so impressed with Stewart in this movie.
So really quick, Brad, I think Thomas Mitchell's fantastic. You know, we first brought him up when we did, I think, Mr. Smith first and then Gone with the Wind. He was in both of those movies. Yep. He's a great character actor. I love him in everything he does. And I think, once again, the character of Uncle Billy is a very broadly written, somewhat comedic, over-the-top character. And he still has those little moments right at the end of the movie where if you don't have an actor as good as Thomas Mitchell, he can't sell the emotion of those final moments. But he still does. And that's, I think, where this movie succeeds is that from top to bottom, even some of the bit players in this movie, they're just really good actors and they know how to sell what they're supposed to do and still give it just that extra little bit of heart that this movie needs to succeed. Because at the end of the day, this is a really kind of preposterous sounding plot for a movie. An angel from heaven like comes down and shows a man who's going to kill himself what happens if he's not alive. It's the kind of movie that could really go off the rails in the hands of a worse director and with worse actors. And I think that the acting especially helps sell the movie.
Well, and beyond that, I will say one of my favorite moments with Thomas Mitchell is when he tells George, was your wedding beautiful? I really wish I had been there.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is about that line, but it gets me every time. But I really think you have to look at Lionel Barrymore in this film as, you know, Old Man Potter. That his performance, I think, might be one of the best villain performances of all time.
Oh, absolutely.
The dude is just pure evil.
And one of the big criticisms of this movie for a long time was that you never actually see Potter get his comeuppance. But that's something that I actually really appreciate. I've always liked that they didn't have some aside where the cops catch him with the money falling out of his pocket and they're like, off to jail with you, Potter. Like, that's not how the real world works. Like, there are people who will continue to get ahead by scheming and by cheating others out of what they deserve. And Potter himself seems to understand this, and he still says, you know, I am an old man and most people hate me, but I don't like them either, so it all balances out. And that's his character. And I think it's much truer to the real world, and it makes the ending of the film that much more impactful because we ultimately see that Potter can have all the money in the world, but what George has is worth more. And that's why when his brother toasts him at the end of the movie and says, to my big brother George, the richest man in town.
Mary, I got him here from the airport just as quick as I could. The fool flew all the way up here in a blizzard.
Harry, how about your Banford in New York?
Oh, I left right in the middle of it. As soon as I got Mary's telegram. Good idea, Ernie. A toast. To my big brother, George, the richest man in town.
Dude.
That's the line that gets me, man, because
Dude.
it means so much.
Well, and that is the comeuppance for Potter. Like, the fact that Potter is the monetarily richest man in town. However, George Bailey, in what really matters in this world, is the richest man in town. You know, I mean, it comes back to that old line that, like, you're not going to be laying on your deathbed thinking about the money you could have made or spent. Like, you're going to be thinking about family and friends and the important moments of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And George isn't going to have to worry about that, but Potter is.
Absolutely.
And I will say, just to illustrate how rich Potter is, I always do this every year because I always forget the numbers. But when you look at the inflation calculator for when
I just did this.
When
I have it on my
he
phone.
offers Potter a job, the $40 a week would translate to roughly about $38,000 to $40,000 a year. The money that he offers him, $20,000 a year, is like $375,000 a year, Bob.
Yeah. Well, that was like earlier when you were saying that they'd lost $8,000. In 1946 dollars, $8,000 is the equivalent of $106,000 today. So
Yeah.
it was a big deal.
Yeah, and so it's little things like that unfortunately, it's just reality that if you make a movie in 1940s and you talk about money back then, it doesn't have the same impact with people in 2020. And so I think it's important that you as a listener of our podcast knows that he would have gone from making $40,000 a year to $375,000 a year. That is the level of cigar dropping that happened in that scene.
Well, Brad, on that note, I think it's time for us to hit pause. What do you say we get into drinking this Midwinter Night's Dram?
Let's get to it.
All right, so today we are checking out a whiskey with one of my favorite names on the market, Brad. From High West Distillery, we just had High West last week with their Yippee-Ki-Yay. This week we're looking at their Midwinter Night's Dram. Obviously a riff on the Shakespeare play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. They really lean into that with this, Brad. This is a whiskey that's technically a limited release, but they make multiple releases of it a year. So think, in the same vein as like a Booker's, where you get 2020-01, 2020-02. What they do with these is each year that they produce it, they give it an act number, and then each batch is given a scene number. And so we're actually drinking Act 6, Scene 6 for a Midwinter Night's Dram. This specific bottle was released almost 2 years ago now, and it was given to us by our friends Bourbon and Stuff. We cannot say, again, enough thank yous to them for providing us with so much whiskey this season. Brad, I've seen this on the shelf. I have been wanting to try this for such a long time. It is on the pricier end of things. So I'm incredibly excited to get into it because it's very sought after. Have you heard of this brand before, Brad?
I have not heard of this brand. However, as I poured this out and gave it a nose, it's just one of those moments where you're like, oh man, like we are in for something great.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Last week we had the Yippee-Ki-Yay. Very similarly to that, High West, the company that makes this, is known for their blending, and this comes from their Rendezvous Rye blend, which is then finished in port barrels. So we have another finished whiskey again this week. Brad, I cannot wait to get into trying this. If they do anything similar to what they did last week with the Yippee-Ki-Yay, I think we're going to like this a lot. This bad boy clocks in at 98.6 proof. So not super high proof. It is no age stated. Brad, what are you picking up on the nose of this?
Bob, as I nose into this whiskey, I feel like I'm getting a little bit of nuttiness, almost like a walnut type of savoriness. And then I'm getting some like dried cherries or raisins or some sort of dried fruit nose that is just spectacular. Like this nose is warm, it's friendly, it draws you in, and there's a lot of complexity to it that I'm just blown away by.
Now, I will say, Brad, we have had this sample sitting on our shelf for a while. It has not seen the light of day in a long time. I probably should have let this open up and breathe a little bit longer than I did. I waited about 5 minutes before giving it my initial nosing, but even then, I actually found the nose to be kind of harsh. It was really rye forward, like grain forward. It had a lot of kind of grassy notes to it. And I got like some rubbing alcohol on this. It was really, really alcohol forward for me. After another 5 minutes or so, I felt like all of those things really died down, but nothing else really came up for me. I didn't get those really great fruit notes that you're talking about. It just kind of seemed like a more muted version of what I already smelled. And that was just basically a very grain and grassy rye whiskey.
Bob, I have a feeling we're going to be way off on this because I really, really liked this nose a lot. I'm surprised to hear that you're not enjoying it that much. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10 on the nose.
Wow.
I really am impressed.
So we might be very different on our nose. I think you'll like where I'm going with the taste, Brad, but for the nose, I'm only going to give it a 6 out of 10. And that does take us into the taste. And Brad, I really love the flavor of this whiskey. It is definitely a rye whiskey. But it's not super spicy. It doesn't have that sort of like sour or dill kind of flavor that we get with some ryes. It's not overly sweet in a bourbon-y type way, but it definitely has some great kind of dark fruit notes to it. And the word that kept coming back to me the more I sipped it, Brad, was creamy. It's just a very creamy kind of rye whiskey with like some great plum, pruny notes on it for me.
Yeah, as I taste this, Bob, it once again, I get a little bit of that nuttiness. I get some of that cherry, that almost plum, dark fruit note.
Mm-hmm.
But here on the palate is where you get a little bit of that rye coming in. I'm noticing the spice a lot more than I did on the nose, and it really kicks it up a notch as far as the flavor goes. I'm going to give it a 9.5 on the flavor.
Wow. Man, Brad, you really love this. I like it a lot. And the note that kept coming out to me the more I'm trying it isn't so much prune, but it's like a fig Newton. Like it has that great bready kind of nice cookie flavor to it, but like a lot of fruit, maybe some dried fruit like figs as well. So I'm going to go like, if you like fig Newtons, you're really going to like this rye whiskey. I'm going to give it an 8.5 on the taste. And that takes us to finish. Brad, are you as high on this on the finish as you are on the nose and the taste?
You know, the nose and taste were just such great experiences for me that the finish was just fine. Like you got all of the notes you kind of got on the start and the middle of the palate. The burn was really nice and smooth. There was nothing overwhelming about this finish. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10 on the finish. I think it was definitely above average. I would even call it really good. It just didn't quite live up to where the palate and nose were.
I do think that the finish was a bit watery for me. Like, it had some great flavor, but then when you go to swallow it, there wasn't really a lot left on my palate. I do think that there was like some, the port notes came out a lot, Brad. There was definitely some winey notes that stayed behind on my palate. But overall, the finish was probably the biggest letdown. It didn't linger very long. There wasn't much of a chest burn going down, so it didn't really make itself known after you swallow it. I'm just going to give it a 7 out of 10 on the finish.
I actually kind of agree with you a little bit. I think that if this was like even just a little bit, like 105 proof, 106 proof, I think that little bit higher viscosity would coat your mouth a little more, leave you with a little something at the end that this is lacking on. But when I come to balance, I think that this is a very complex whiskey. Not like the most complex that we've ever had, but it's got enough crazy stuff going on that I think it really balances it well together into an extremely palatable whiskey. I'm going to give it a 8.5 out of 10 on balance.
Yeah, Brad, I'm going to give it an 8 on balance. Like I said, the nose was harsher than the taste or the finish. And then the finish was milder than the nose or the taste. So it definitely started out really harsh and got more mild as it went. So it's not a perfect balance, but I think if you asked me, would I rather have it that way or the opposite, I'd rather it finish smooth, and that's what it does. So I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10 on balance. And that takes us to overall value. This is where things get really interesting, Brad, because just like with the Yippee-Ki-Yay, this is a very pricey bottle of whiskey. And I will say, I did some research on this particular batch, the Act 6, Scene 6, and it seems to be one of the lower rated ones among people who have tried multiple batches of Midwinter Night's Dram. And I kind of hope that that's the case, because I liked this a lot, Brad, but it didn't wow me and it didn't like knock my socks off. And the price point on this is $99.95 in the state of Ohio. It sells for even more outside of price controlled states. So if I'm going to pay $100 or more for a bottle of whiskey, I really want to know that what's in the bottle is consistent and is really, really good. And I'll say this, if this is the worst it gets, then it's a really good whiskey. And I think that you can safely pick a bottle of this up and know that it's going to be good. The question is the worst expression of this worth $100? And for me, I'm just not sure it is. Brad, it sounds like you are in a really good spot with your score. What are you feeling about the value right now?
I feel like the triple digits is a lot of money for a whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
Like anytime you're spending $100 on a fifth, it better be knocking your socks off. And while I would say that this is coming close to that, it's not quite there at a $99 price range. I think maybe if this was like, I don't know, $55 to $70, I'd be like, this is a phenomenal value. So I don't know, maybe it should be priced like $70 to $80, and I'd be like, yeah, that's fine. As it is, I'm going to give it a 6.5 on value. I think it's still really good. I think it's still worth trying. And, if you have about 5 or 6 friends who want to go in on it, buy a bottle. It'd be worth, drinking around a fire with some friends. But $100 is pretty steep.
Yeah, I'm in a very similar spot that you are, Brad. And I'm kind of breaking my rule here to give it a 7 out of 10, which is what I'm going to give it. Because we usually say we can only evaluate what we have in the glass in front of us. And what we have just happens to be one of the lowest rated versions of this. And so I'm just trusting everybody else that they're right when they say that it only goes up from here. And that's kind of why I am giving it a 7. Because if we were only judging it on the merits of this glass, I'd probably give it a lower score. But I'm going to go ahead and give it a 7 out of 10 on value. And Brad, what is that bringing you out to?
I'm at a 41.5 out of 50.
I'm at a 37.5 out of 50. So that's putting us at a 39.5. We are almost there at that 40 mark for this, which is really where we mark high quality whiskeys. I think this is very, very good. I do wish we would have been able to try one of those kind of mind blowing expressions that I see people talking about from time to time on the Midwinter Night's Dram. But still, overall, a really good whiskey.
Yeah, honestly, Bob, I think 39.5 is like a perfect spot for this whiskey. It is on the edge of an upper echelon, just great whiskey. Not quite there, but really, really great.
All right, Brad, so we're carrying some positive energy back into our conversation about one of our favorite films, It's a Wonderful Life. So what do you say we get back to talking about it?
Let's get to it.
All right, so that was a Midwinter Night's Dram, a whiskey that we both really, really liked. And we're getting back into talking about a movie that we absolutely love in It's a Wonderful Life. But Brad, knowing that we're both going to come down on a 10 out of 10 for this movie, I got to ask you, do you think it's like a perfect movie, or are you willing to pick some nits with me?
Oh, no, dude. There's a few parts of this movie. I think that we said earlier that all of the main actors in this movie, and I'd include like Uncle Billy in that, anybody that you might recognize the name of, I think is just knocks it out of the park, does a phenomenal job. However, some of the other actors and actresses in this movie were not so great. And there's a few specific moments, but like when the one high schooler comes up to Alfalfa and offers him the key to open up the gym floor, that is like some of the worst acting I've seen in my life. It's just plain old bad. And there's a few other moments like this throughout the movie where I'm like, man, Capra, like, couldn't you have directed them just a tiny bit better to like ham it up a little bit less? I don't know. Did that bother you at all, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of one of the hallmarks of Frank Capra, though. Like, his movies were known by their critics as Capricorn. Like, they were called corny even back in the day. And he really does lean into, like, the sentimental. And because of that, he also leans into some, like, really over-the-top, almost slapsticky kind of performances when he wants people to be funny. And that was the same thing we saw in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And, Brad, if I can kind of steer into my nitpick with the movie, I don't even know if it's a nitpick as much as I want to get your opinion on it. One of our big criticisms with Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, I think could be applied to this movie too, which is that I don't want to say that it drags, but the middle section of this movie is just really, really shaggy. It goes on for a long, long time. And while most of what happens in the story of George Bailey's life gets a payoff at the end, I don't think everything does. And I think that you probably could have cut, 15, 20 minutes out of this movie, and it would still be really, really good. And so I'm wondering, Brad, like, do you find that even though we love this movie, that it is a bit shaggy in parts?
Honestly, Bob, I don't. Out of all the nitpicks that I have for this movie, which, aren't a ton, that's not really one of them. I think there might be a few moments at the start of the film that drag on a tiny bit. But honestly, once you get wrapped up in the life of George Bailey, for me, it almost feels like a bang-bang like movement from event to event to event. And they all represent this nuanced change in George's life as he gets older that I actually really don't mind the middle portion. I was actually going to say, I feel like the transition from the middle part of the movie to the dream sequence, if we're going to call it that,
is really clunky.
That transition feels really strange. And like you said, it feels kind of clunky.
Yeah.
And so if there's anything I get frustrated with about the pacing of the movie, it is that movement from the first whole part of the movie to the I've Never Been Born sequence.
Yeah. And Brad, that was actually what I had circled to talk about in the second half of the episode. And I don't want to suggest that I want to change this whole movie, because I don't. I think that the version of this movie that we got is the best possible version of this movie that we could have had. However, like, this was the first time watching this movie that I asked myself, like, just to entertain the idea, would this movie have been better without the angel stuff?
Yeah.
Because I really do think that it's almost like you have two separate movies. You have the very beginning about the angels and the very end about the angel and the supernatural stuff. And then you have like a whole self-contained movie in the middle of those two things that I think plays really, really well as a very human drama. And you really feel the emotion of George Bailey and the despair. And then it kind of takes this really sharp turn into like the score doing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and this, pudgy little old man saying stuff about being an angel.
To save me.
Well, I did, didn't I? You didn't go through with it, did you?
Go through with what?
Suicide.
Oh, it's against the law to commit suicide around here.
Yeah, it's against the law where I come from, too.
Oh, where do you come from?
Heaven?
And it just really is a bumpy transition to me. And for the first time, it made me wonder, like, was there another way this story could have been told? Not that I really want it to change, but like, how could we have either made that transition smoother or gotten George to the point where he thinks he has a wonderful life without kind of like shoehorning in this silly angel plotline?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can think of would be if it actually literally was like an unconscious dream sequence. Like he jumps in the river and, the boatman in the harbor saves him and drags him out, but he had knocked his head on something. And while he's passing out, you have him muttering, I wish I'd never been born. I wish I'd never been born.
Right. I mean, it could have been like Wizard of Oz, where she gets knocked out during the tornado.
And then you show him waking up and he walks around and it's the dream sequence and he's never been born. And then lo and behold, he wakes up for real and is, he was dreaming and now he has an appreciation for his world. I think you could have done all of that. The problem then is how do you start the movie without a narrator then?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And so again, like, does that mean that this is like a fundamental flaw? When it can't be solved, do you just have to kind of throw your hands up and admit there's something about the way this movie's told that no matter how you tell it, there's going to be a bump in the road?
Yeah, because it is such a strange concept to literally go about and see your world as if, you were never born. And like, I think about other movies, like I think about 17 again with Zac Efron.
Mm-hmm.
And like, he is able to look at his current world from the lens of a 17-year-old who they don't know, is their dad or husband. And so that's kind of a similar thing. But once again, like it's not. There's just something that's a little bit harsh about the transition to Clarence. And like, I don't know, there's this seriousness with the movie of like, I'm about to kill myself. And then all of a sudden you have this lighthearted Tom Sawyer reading, Clarence Oddbody Angel who jumps in, and you have this lighthearted comedic scene where the harbor man is falling out of his chair and running out of the room. And it just feels a little strange. And yet at the same time, like, I think that Clarence is endearing and funny. And the way he orders a drink, the flaming rum punch, and then he goes, "Oh, Joseph, don't worry, I wasn't going to drink it anyways." Like, there's something just so funny and endearing about Clarence that I can't imagine this movie without him, even though I'm right there with you in saying that it's not the smoothest move in the book by Capra.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and Brad, I think this is a good transition into talking about the critical reception for this movie. And before we started recording, I actually had asked you to do a little bit of research and watch this Netflix miniseries called Five Came Back, which is based on a book, and they're both fantastic, the miniseries and the book, which is about these 5 famous Hollywood directors who all went off and served in World War II, many of them in a filmmaking capacity, and what happened to them when they came back from the war, and how you can see how the war really affected them in the movies they made when they got back. And so we've already done one of those films on the podcast, which would be John Huston's Treasure of the Sierra Madre. But one of the directors that's profiled on this miniseries is Frank Capra. And unfortunately, the first movie he made when he came back from World War II was It's a Wonderful Life. And it is maybe the most unabashedly earnest and sentimental movie that he ever made, even more so than a movie like, You Can't Take It With You, or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, or Mr. Deeds. More than any of those. And for some reason, audiences just did not latch onto that in the post-war environment. This movie was a huge commercial flop, so much so that it put this new independent filmmaking business that Capra launched out of business. It hurt Capra so badly that he basically took a break from making movies for a long time. And I wonder, Brad, first of all, I guess, what do you think caused that failure? And why do you think audiences came around to the idea of this movie being so unabashedly sentimental when it seemed like they were really turned off by it at first?
Well, Bob, I think that the way you can understand the failure of It's a Wonderful Life is just by looking at another film that they talked about in the documentary, one that I didn't actually see, full disclosure. But from what they said in the documentary, it seems like a movie like The Best Years of Our Lives is what America was craving post-World War I and II. That in a world that has been so devastated and destroyed by loss of so many men in this war, and just an understanding that, like, this might be getting a little bit meta, but there was this idea in modernism of the ascension of man, that humans were going to keep getting better and better and better, and that we were going to stop violence against each other, and that we were going to reach this utopian ideal. And World War I and II, World War II especially, were just these stark, like, grounding of reality of, no, humans are not good. We're not getting better. The only thing we're getting better at is killing each other. And so when you have a movie like It's a Wonderful Life that is ultimately sentimental and redemptive, I just don't know if the American public was ready for such a story of redemption after witnessing one of the most horrific events in human history.
Mm-hmm. So why do you think audiences came around to it then? Like, what? Is it just like that it's such a good movie or what?
I think it's partially because of what you said earlier, that it was just readily available as a, public domain property. But I think in the end, it's just a great movie with great acting. I think it's great writing. There's a few rough spots here and there, but when you watch this movie, Bob, I just love this movie.
Yeah, I do too.
And also, I also think that it's kind of that sense of annualism about it, that you see it every year, year in and year out. And, everybody has their Christmas movies that they watch every year, and not everybody watches the same movies. I watch White Christmas every year. I have a hard time deciding between White Christmas and It's a Wonderful Life for my favorite Christmas movie every year. But, there's certain movies that you watch year in and year out, and there's something that builds inside your soul when you connect so deeply with a movie, with such an important part of the year. And I don't know, there's just something about Christmas and the winter season and the movies that you watch and the family that you spend time with that has really embedded It's a Wonderful Life into the heart of American culture.
Yeah, and I think that, like, for whatever reason, it has always seemed like movie critics just don't like it when movies are overly sentimental. But gosh darn it, like, this movie is just unashamed in how sentimental it is. And I really love it. And I think something about the Christmas of it all too, Brad, just kind of makes this movie impervious to any criticisms about how sentimental it is. And I always come back to the mental image of the bank examiner at the end of the movie, having a little wad of cash in his hand and then just saying, screw it. And he tosses it on the pile and he says, like, I want to be in this moment. I want to enjoy and celebrate this guy, even if he did commit a crime, which the guy probably thinks he did. That there's a better story to be told, which is the story of his redemption, and that this guy wants to participate in that. And I think that's ultimately what brings me back to this movie. Like, is it perfect? No. And if you ask me, like, objectively, would I put this up against a Citizen Kane? Like, yeah, they're both really great movies, but they're just a different kind of movie. And this is the kind of movie that you gravitate towards to comfort you and to tell you something deeper and to tell you there's something more out there for all of us. And so for both of us, this movie is a 10 out of 10. And I don't think that anything that we point out as a flaw or a nitpick is going to change that in my mind.
Can I actually point out one last nitpick for me?
Yeah, sure.
I hate the bell ringing and, look, Daddy, that teacher says that means an angel gets his wings. Like, shut up.
All right. Well, on that note,
I don't know why. Although I will say you get that funny moment with Nick where he goes, "Hey, look, I'm giving everybody the wings.
I'm giving out wings, yeah."
In the most like stereotypical Guido accent.
Oh yeah. Well, guys, that has been It's a Wonderful Life. We want to hear what you think about this movie. It is our favorite Christmas movie. Is it yours? You can talk to us about this movie by getting on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Film Whiskey.
Or you can give us a phone call. Let your voice be heard on the Film and Whiskey podcast. Our phone number is 216-800-5923. Once again, it's 216-800-5923. Or you can leave a voicemail on our website, which is anchor.fm/filmwhiskey.
And don't forget, we have just launched a Patreon account where you can sponsor us on a monthly basis for as little as $3 a month. Brad and I are actually going to record a special Patreon-exclusive bonus episode where we continue talking about It's a Wonderful Life as soon as we get off of here. So if you'd like to hear more of our takes on It's a Wonderful Life, please consider sponsoring us on our Patreon account, patreon.com/filmwhiskey. From both of us here at the Film and Whiskey Podcast, we want to say a very, very Merry Christmas to everybody out there. We'll be back next week with another regularly scheduled episode. But until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time. Film and Whiskey is produced, engineered, and edited by Bob Book and Brad G. And it's made possible from support from listeners like you. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate directly to us at our Anchor page, anchor.fm/filmwhiskey, where you can support the show for as little as $1 a month. Or if you'd like some perks, donate to our Patreon page. You can find us on patreon.com/filmwhiskey, where for as little as $3 a month, you'll receive benefits like membership to an exclusive Discord chat room, extended cuts of each episode, and early access to every Film and Whiskey episode. We want to say thank you again to our Patreon supporters, especially those sponsoring us at our highest viscosity level, and that includes our friends Corey Easterday, James Talbert, Austin Dupree, and Aperture Flash. We'll see you next week.